And I'm delighted to welcome you to the first of a series of programs co-sponsored with the UNM Press featuring new publications. The LAI's mission is to promote and support interdisciplinary teaching, research, and meaningful public engagement to advance the production and dissemination of knowledge about Latin America and Iberia. Latin America is designated as one of 7 priority areas of research for UNM, and we proudly contribute to both the university's intellectual community as well as global discourse through programming. I'd like to first acknowledge that the University of New Mexico sits on the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia. The original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, since time immemorial, have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples. We greatly recognize our history. And I would now like to introduce Dr. Matthew Martinez, Deputy Director of the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture, who will introduce today's panel.
Welcome, and thank you for having me and all of our guests here. I look forward to a great conversation with everybody here. I'm a 97 graduate of UNM and political science and Spanish, so it's always good to connect with my Lobo friends and community virtually at least. So again, wishing you all well and good health during these times. I'd also like to acknowledge the place where I'm coming from here in Ogapoge, which is White Shell Water Place in Santa Fe. And I encourage you all who are joining us to honor Indigenous place names where you come from in your own families and communities too. So today's discussion is focusing on Querencia, reflections on the New Mexico homeland. And here is the gorgeous, beautiful cover. And this volume is edited by Vanessa Fonseca Chavez, Levi Romero, and Spencer Herrera. And so I was really excited to order this book hot off the press because I heard a lot about it through the friends and the contributors in the volume here. And you're in for a surprise and a treat if you have not picked it up and read through it all. And so I want to introduce the panelists joining us today as part of the program. Today we have Kevin Brown, who joined the university libraries in March of 2016. Kevin has 2 BAs, one from the Institute of American Indian Arts and Museum Studies, and the other from the University of Arizona in anthropology. He also has an MA from UNM in public archaeology and is currently working on his PhD in archaeology. Through his work with the New Mexico Native American youth, he gained a wealth of experience in student engagement and retention. He has intimate knowledge of the Center for Southwest Research and special collections that he acquired through his fellowship in 2013 and 14. He is also an artist and photographer, and Kevin is a member of the Navajo Nation. Next, I want to introduce Mariana Nunn, who is the Director and Chief Curator of the Art Museum and Visual Arts Program at the National Hispanic Cultural Center in Albuquerque. Previous to this, she spent 9 years as the Curator of Contemporary Hispano and Latino Collections at the Museum of International Folk Art in Santa Fe. She's the author of Sin Nombre, Hispana and Hispano Artist of the New Deal Era. Nunn received her MA and PhD in Latin American Studies from the University of New Mexico, where she researched and focused on Spanish colonial contemporary, Latin American, and Chicano and Latino history. So welcome, Nunn. Next, I want to introduce Irene Vasquez. She specializes in the intersectional histories and politics of Mexican descent populations in the Americas. Her research and teaching interests include US and transnational social and political movements. She co-authored a book on the Chicano movement titled Making Aztlán, Ideology and Culture of the Chicana and Chicano Movement Ideology, 1966 to 1977, published by UNM. She has written several essays in English and Spanish on the historic and contemporary relations between African Americans and Latin American descent peoples in the Americas. Irene Vasquez also co-edited the Borders in All of Us, New Approaches to Global Diasporic Societies, published by New World African Press. She's currently working on publications centering on immigrant and human rights organizing in the US. In addition, she has previously published essays on indigenous peoples in what is today northern Mexico. So welcome panelists and guests. So I just want to, well, let's just get right into the discussion. So, you know, in the forward in the book, Rodolfo Anaya stated that Querencia is love of home and love of place. And, you know, reading his essay, this is my understanding, his last publication before he passed away. So it's something of a real, almost manito manifesto to think about New Mexico history and culture. And so I was glad to see the words of him up front. But in general, this is really a collection of essays that serves as a testament to the beauty of our state. Querencia could not be more timely as New Mexico continues to struggle amidst a global pandemic, threats to sacred sites, and strained community relations played out by removal of statues, monuments, and destruction of national landscapes and homelands. The edited collection is dedicated to community activist and author and farmer, and I knew Esteban very well here in northern New Mexico. And he wrote that Querencia is that which gives us a sense of place, which anchors us to the land, which makes us a unique people. So suffice it to say, there's a lot of themes in this edited collection to unpack. And we often hear in existing literatures and ethnic studies and in history and relevant fields that discuss these notions of placemaking and creating spaces. And I'd like to really maybe unpack that further and ask our guests here and have you respond to how you think about placemaking and creating spaces. And how does this look in your own particular work? In addition, it's important to think about how you situate yourself as a writer and author and on a practical level through your own professional self. So I don't have an order here. Anybody want to take a stab at that first response?
I guess I'll go. So from my perspective, so I'm Dene. I was born in Shiprock, New Mexico, and I was raised in Chinle, Arizona, and Canada Shea area. And the thought of placemaking for me, there's a symbolic act and a spiritual act that we do, and I mentioned this in my chapter, is that we anchor ourselves metaphysically to the land through our umbilical cord after we were born, and we offer that as a direct metaphysical tie to the landscape. And it led me to think that even in quote unquote physically vacant spaces, they're not culturally vacant. There's a cultural embodiment to these landscapes and placemaking. So whomever's land that it is situated in, there's still a cultural connection to that. Whether it be in my case, from my Dene heritage, that act, but also as you mentioned, there's place names in Santa Fe where you mentioned it, and there's many different place names associated with these landscapes and placemaking. So that cultural, vacancy is present in all of the landscapes that we occupy. So.
Good afternoon,
Irene,
everyone.
I was like, Irene and I are in a standoff. Let's go.
So I'm Irene Vasquez, and I actually was born in El Paso, Texas, and raised primarily in a rural area of California called Cherry Valley. And, you know, I often really see myself as the product of generations of border crossers, because, you know, if I look at my mom and dad's generation, they weren't born where their parents were born. And if you go back before them, you know, you're likely going to find this pattern. And so I think that I have a deep respect for the indigenous peoples of the continent that have this enduring connection, you know, to the land that we stand on, and that we live on as you know, I consider myself both of Mexican descent and being Chicana. And so, you know, from my own perspective, it's hard to situate one home, but I also think, you know, I'm tending more to see, you know, the idea of home and place as really a process. And for Mexican descent peoples whose histories and communities were truncated by colonialism, capitalism, imperialism, you know, those are the realities we face, that disconnection from our roots, from our homelands. And so then how, you know, do those of us who identify in that way root ourselves to the world, right? And so in many ways, for me being the chair of Chicana and Chicano studies, I see, you know, our field of study as a home and a place. And that is where I seek, right, to build community and to be a part of something that incredibly is orienting itself to this notion of relations and really relationality. We identify ourselves, you know, for our own reasons. We have that self-identity. We have a notion of self-identity, but it always works in relation to other people's and our ecosystems and how it is that we see our relation to the world. So in my case, it is hard to talk about a specific home or homeland, but I seek to develop those concepts in a community of people who embrace the idea that knowledge is life-giving. It's not life-subtracting. And that's sort of my framework for understanding who I am.
I always love hearing Kevin and Irene talk about their connection to place. And you know, I come at this try to answer this question from two ways. One is that on a national level, all the big foundations and big philanthropic bodies have, you know, all of a sudden, first of all, decided that there needs to be equity in grant giving. So that's great that they started doing that, but they're all about placemaking right now. Placemaking and monuments and placemaking and monuments. And I really wonder that in those initiatives, if they're really going to be really meaningful and make a difference, as opposed to talking the talk. And I often in my work, I mean, my whole mission has been to sort of insert, you know, Nuevo Mexicano, Chicano, Latino artists, and especially from New Mexico, into a national dialogue, because our colleagues, you know, with all of the issues of identity that happen in New Mexico, our colleagues don't understand. Our Latinx colleagues don't always understand. And I just always feel like they should just come here if they're going to be studying placemaking and community and monuments and the issues of monuments, because we could teach them a lot, you know. From the perspective of my job at the National Hispanic Cultural Center in the museum, you know, we try to rectify the placemaking that's gone wrong, right? The placemaking in the states, not all the states museums, Matt, but in many of the states museums and the larger institutions that haven't really focused on Hispano or Mestizo artists who, you know, because they don't understand, because they don't take the time to understand the community and the place from which the artists come from, and that the gatekeepers in those institutions are not from the communities. They're looking from an outside perspective. And so I've been thinking about these two things because the, you know, monuments are a big buzzword right now. And I'm just like, please just look at us as a case study, and study what we've done well and study what we've done wrong. And don't dismiss New Mexico's role in these national dialogues. That's the long answer.
Yeah, that's good. I'm thinking about, you know, how all of you situate very uniquely, but there's a common thread as far as the place of that goes. And, you know, as an undergrad at UNM, one of my life-changing moments was, you know, taking courses in the Spanish department, and you know, your mom,
I was gonna
Gianna, was
say,
one of my
you
professors.
were there when she was there? Yes.
And Orlando and Enrique La Madrid, and you know, so I ended up doing a study abroad program abroad, right? And you know, I became fluent in Spanish, but my connections are really with local indigenous peoples in Mexico City and Michoacan and other places that I traveled to. And it made me self-reflect a larger commonality of colonialism, what has happened to indigenous peoples and systemic structures. And it was just, you know, as a 20-year-old kid, I just was never really, you know, kind of schooled in understanding that, or I didn't have the language for that until I actually went. And obviously came back and, you know, made me appreciate things of home a lot better. And it was kind of like those connect the dots, right? There's these systems of change that happened. And, you know, I owe that to my faculty and my mentors there at the university for making that. So I ended up serving most recently as lieutenant governor of my tribe at Oquewingue. So I'm Tewa on my father's side, and my mother side is Chicana from northern New Mexico and El Rito, small farming town and community. And so again, it's just about connecting these dots and these places, and really just traveling abroad made me make those lights go out, so to speak. And your chapter and the chapter that you all wrote, Tay, you talk about nothing at the table about us without us. And so I would just want to kind of throw that out there about who's the us that we're talking about, and why is that important to engage and enter these conversations of systemic change.
Somebody else want to go? Well, I put that in there because, you know, certainly at the National Hispanic Cultural Center, but a lot of colleagues with different, you know, a lot of different background colleagues, we joke about how, you know, the week before Dia de los Muertos at the National Hispanic Cultural Center or the National Museum of Mexican Art in Chicago or someplace like that, you get a call going, we want to be diverse. We want to know how to do a Dia de los Muertos. Or I have a friend who just posted on Facebook who is Panamanian, who is like, it's halfway through the month of February. If you call me and you want me to speak about Black History Month, I'm not going to do it. Okay. Because, you know, it's you can't have a meaningful dialogue about ethnic diversity, racial diversity, just diversity, equity and inclusion, DEI stuff, without having, it can't be superficial anymore. And it's been really superficial for a very long time. And you know, I still to this day get calls like, can you give us some names? We don't know anybody in that community or those communities. We're really looking for a Latino. And it's you know, it's really irritating. It shouldn't be happening in the 21st century, but it is.
Yeah. And just something that reflected on to me and what you said about us, and automatically I thought, you know, humans. But then if you really consider the philosophy of, if you want to go back into indigeneity and philosophy, us includes everyone living and breathing and living in that same space of place. So, you know, and that's really telling for me to just even think about humans when we're occupying the same space with, you know, natural, you know, entities and natural, you know, bodies of resources that we do manipulate for our own human need and our own human selfishness, honestly. And the us has to be broadened to include all that occupy a certain place or space. And when you really think about the us and that, then you become more humble and altruistic in those ways of thinking not I'm going to build a house here, but is this allowable to build a house here, versus is it respectful to build it here that doesn't disrupt the natural flow of order, so to speak. And we see that, you know, happening in this because this is current what's happening in Texas, because these built systems have literally collapsed on, you know, people living in Texas right now. But those same systems have benefited humans, but also really I guess handicapped humans in that capacity. But I was thinking, and while all these news stories are happening, we have, you know, animals who are occupying that same system and that same area, land-based area, who are just as impacted by that also. But we see the attention drifting towards, you know, to us humans. So so I just wanted to broaden that out to us, to include multiple other organisms and plants and places that occupy it with us, and not to impose our own human-centric, you know, norms on that too. So
I appreciate the comments that came before, and to respond to your question, Dr. Martinez, I think that when you read the quote and then listening to the commentary that followed, if we use the institution of the university as that table, right, then we ask, is there full inclusion, right? If we're looking at this notion of an inclusive us, which Kevin has offered to this discussion, then we would need to be, you know, critical of the structure and the processes of the university, right? So UNM went through, and that's a part of the discussion, right? It's you know, the symbol used, right, at the university, the imagery at the university, right? It exists, you know, in conflict with the living indigenous peoples of this land, right? And so a more inclusive university would be one that recognizes the dynamic histories and the travesties that have been inflicted on Native communities in the area, but that would also recognize how African and Latino descent people have played an integral role in the development of any modern day society in the Americas. And as such, these populations have helped to build the state. And so therefore, right, the university would be cognizant of being responsive to African, Latin American, Asian American populations, and truly create a university where all are included. And that means looking at the structures of the university from the top to the bottom, or the bottom to the top, however you want to position an analysis of the university. And so when I was thinking of that quote, I thought about the development of ethnic and women and gender and sexuality program studies, the ways in which they developed, right, beginning in the late 60s and moving through the 1970s, and the ways in which they were advocating for a positive college and university environment, right? And the ways in which they were calling attention to that incompleteness, right? The incompleteness of recognizing, the histories of diverse peoples, in the United States, the incompleteness of properly recognizing those contributions and making a university education affordable, and I would say even free for some, especially, folks in the working class and those who live in poverty, but also importantly, ensuring that representatives of those communities who really have the best interests of these communities are represented there and are in positions to make the kinds of decisions that affect, everything from the architecture, the arts, the curriculum, the personnel, right? We need a university and college and K through 12 system that really is oriented toward this multi-species futurity. And I think that's what your question made me think about. Sorry, I went on.
No, that's good. Thanks for sharing that. And your chapter, you wrote about the Zimmerman murals, right? So it's about representation and how those are projected. And Kevin, you probably walk through there every day doing your own research, and Tay's no stranger to art and controversy. But it's really about voice and representation, right? And who controls this larger narrative. And so thinking about relics and symbols, obviously, we recently all watched what happened at the Capitol on January 6th. You saw images of the Confederate flag and, so many other deep-seated entrenched symbols. The visual of that was very pronounced. And, I'm wondering what you all think. What is the connection of these national symbols and current events? Is there a connection with what is happening in New Mexico with the removal of Oñate and that narrative as far as patriot and symbolic pride symbols, right? Pride in the name of the Proud Boys pride, right? Not diversity of pride, but what is a larger narrative between kind of the local landscape, with this larger systemic way of how we think about symbols and representation?
Since you brought up the Zimmerman Library as a point of discussion, honestly, I didn't pay attention to that mural until someone pointed it out to me. So in terms of recognizing these symbols, someone has to pay attention to those symbols and what it represents. And me occupying a public space and just casually walking through, the West Wing area of Zimmerman, I thought, just not taking a deeper analysis of what they represent. I just thought it's beautiful. It matches the building, the aesthetic. It makes sense why it would be, positioned there and why it was commissioned to be in that space. But as I engaged with the subject matter even more, I realized how historically inaccurate they were. and how contextual they need to be placed in. Based in the 1930s rhetoric and language, that was appropriate painting to have and to represent specific people. And I'm only going to focus on one segment of that mural, and that's the first segment, and that's about representation of Native people. And it's painting Native people to be stereotypically Southwest, doing crafts and occupying a space as a stoic, I'm going to say tobacco Indians, because it's kind of similar to what trading posts have, as they're posed and positioned. But then I went into deeper analysis, because my background is in archaeology, and I can analyze some subject matter related to that. And I realized in the 1930s, a lot of indigenous communities in the Southwest were dealing with reservation policies that had positioned them to be economically disadvantaged than other communities. That maybe the reason why they turned to craft making, maybe why they turn into those quote unquote stereotypical things, because there was nothing for them to partake in an economic sense. Because throughout the Southwestern history, indigenous people were occupying a deeply important economic role, from trading to crops and domestication in the Southwest. And through these subsequent colonial policies with the reservation period, it segmented them into a more, basically just put them in one place where they can't trade readily, they can't reconstitute their ancestral economic systems like they could before. So it really circumvented them into these limited options that potentially may have led them to do these craft making. So, and not paying true justice to the full contextual picture of one subject matter is, my belief, historically inaccurate, because these paintings are supposed to represent indigenous people and represent the three peoples in New Mexico. So having a deeper analysis of these symbols is really important to have a fully engaged discussion of these symbols in action and in public places. And another thing too is that, since this is brought up, is that I see cultural evolution as a theoretical framework at play in these panels, and these cultural evolutionary models depicts groups of people who progress in evolutionary stages that occupy specific evolutionary characteristics, and each panel shows a progression of quote unquote advancement. You have indigenous people, on the lowest tier of that evolutionary stage, and then you have subsequent complexity with that as you move forward. So I kind of see cultural evolutionary frameworks at play in those murals too. So that adds another layer to the context of these images and symbols. So.
Well, it makes me want to say something that could be controversial, because it's all about the gatekeeper and the author, right? I don't want to say chronicler, but it's all about that. And that those murals were by an Anglo male artist in the 30s, 40s, whenever it was. And many of the monuments that have come down in New Mexico are by Hispanic, Spanish artists, male artists. And so we might want to, when you're talking about who's at the table to make the decisions, is that there are very few women depicted in those. I mean, there are in the murals in Zimmerman, but certainly in the giant monuments of male conquerors, that it doesn't, I mean, at the Albuquerque Museum, there are some. But when we're talking about those monuments, we're not talking about Nora Naranjo Morris's work. I find her installation in sort of peeking at the view of the Spanish coming in to be one of the most moving monuments I've ever seen. And so it's all about the categories of, you know, why aren't we referring to Nora's as a monument? You know, it doesn't get in when you're reading the news articles, it's not there. You know, she's there sometimes, but it's so, you know, it really is about who's doing the telling and what their personal view gaze is in their interpretation of it. And it does so much damage in the media. And you know, I found some of that. I found reading male reporters' stories of what happened at the Capitol versus female reporter stories of what happened in the Capitol to be quite different in the rhetoric. You know, there was lots of charging and, you know, and which there was, but it I don't know. I don't know what I'm saying right now, but there's something there someday.
I thought I might add that, you know, in sort of looking at the past to the present, right, that we have to acknowledge, right, that white supremacy is imbricated in all aspects of our life. And so, you know, whether we're looking at, you know, the presidents of the United States, you know, well, actually throughout the 1700s, but if we look at people like Thomas Jefferson, who were about expansionism and about dispossession of land, and we move forward into presidents and policymakers and journalists who are espousing the same kinds of notions, right, through the idea of manifest destiny. We understand that those ideologies, those practices, those policies are emanate from white supremacy. And so, you know, it is you know, I heard different commentaries on what transpired in Washington, D.C. And of course, you know, some folks are surprised and some folks really aren't, because the notions of hate that were being espoused throughout, you know, the last presidency, they're not new, right? Casting people of color, whether they're indigenous or of Latin American descent or African American or Asian American or Arab American in the most vile terms, right, is a long, and let me not forget, LGBTQ IA folks, is we have a long history of this in this country. And so I think that, you know, we as a society need to really grapple with this and root it out. You know, you know, we don't have a future if white supremacy, you know, is underlaying all the structures in our society, as well as homophobia and sexism. So I think that, you know, we're all a working project, but it's an important one.
Yeah, it's one thing that came up in your discussion, Irene, is that the Capitol building has paintings in them too that depict similar themes of American nationalism. I mean, if you go into Capitol Rotunda, there's a well-known painting of indigenous people being subjected to expansionism. And you go back to the local with the Adams murals in the Zimmerman Library, it's the same nationalistic narrative of the last colonial settlers coming into a space and repainting or retelling a narrative that fits their narrative. So with Irene's point of the white supremacy is well taken, and it's a clear, thorough through line between our local to the national perspectives of nationalism. So.
Yeah, I think that's pretty interesting to obviously think about these larger connections and symbols, and you know, I just think that our students and our communities are really struggling for a language to understand current events, and really how to impact these. And I have a sixth grader who watches the news with me, and you know, what's our youth and generation, what are they thinking about, right? What's going on in their mind? And so, you know, again, back to this larger framework of Querencia, this place, this love of place as a people, as a landscape, as everything ecological that Kevin brought out as far as beyond people, beyond humans. How can that be a language or solution or a tool in our toolbox to think about really understanding who we are as people, right? People in the most general sense. So how do you think that might be a useful framework?
That's a huge question.
I know.
And I would love to hear, you know, if folks who are participating would want to chime in on that as well. We try in Chicana and Chicano studies, we've developed outreach, educational outreach to our communities, because we understand that so many people are left behind. I mean, at UNM, you know, we receive students, many have gone through many obstacles, but on their, you know, through their journey there, so many others are lost along the way. And so part of, you know, part of our vision for the future is really moving towards more open educational platforms, whether they're face-to-face or online. I mean, that some of that depends on you know, our current conditions, but I mean, a framework we have for working with teachers is that in the classroom, again, this idea that knowledge is life-giving, and whether it's, you know, whether it's discrimination, right, as a practice, or whether it's an oppressive classroom that stifles, you know, young and old alike, right? You know, those things need to end. And so creating spaces, right, where there's full inclusion, where, you know, all people, their communities, what they bring is honored, right? And understanding that that having a strong connectedness to other people, even if, you know, they may not culturally or ethnically be similar to us, overall that kind of a nurturing and inclusive environment is going to be one where all people feel more respected and appreciated. So how do we enact that at large, and in fact take into consideration that we need to think about ourselves as living in a multi-species world, and anything that takes life away from plants or animals, you know, those practices, they you know, they need to be stopped.
When I brought up when I brought up my comment about us as being more holistically inclusive, I was thinking about the linguistic ideologies that we have related to our own, you know, to our own systems of knowing. I mean, if we design a system to be anthrocentric, then we're going to have very specific anthro or human-based curriculum and pedagogy. And from that perspective, then we're always going to exclude other multi-species. We're always going to exclude them. We're always going to other, you know, the other systems that we occupy. And honestly, that way of, you know, perspectivism comes about with colonialism and property and ownership, and having direct land title to specific domains of landscapes that says you own this specific area. That will always be in place, and if you have those systems available. And the alternative to that is one is declaring that this is everyone's space, not mine, not yours, not this community, not your community, that we all occupy this space, and having a shared, you know, process in that I guess that renewed lifestyle of cooperation, with true cooperation, where you're not thinking of yourself only, that you're really literally altruistic in your motivations. So,
well, and I would add to, I think when I was writing the answers for that chapter, I kept on thinking about you know, like a moment in time, or you know, an event that happens, and so you get one person's in account of it, right, and that becomes the memorial. But there were several different other people, I shouldn't be using seven, there were a lot of people, a lot of things and people, and they all have their own account of that moment. And why do you pick just one? You know, why isn't it coming from several perspectives of that moment instead of just one person's vision? Because it seems to me that will be always complete. And memory, you know, we haven't really talked about memory, but you know, people's memories of things are going to be different, even if they all experience the same thing. And I just kept on thinking, you know, how would that look like if you were designing a commemorative or some sort of memorial, where you had everybody's account of that same moment in time or that same place. It would be very different, but we always seem to, you know, select one voice for that. And how is that one voice selected? And memory plays a big part in Querencia here.
So I think we can open it up for a larger discussion. If others have questions they want to pose to any of the panelists along what we talked about, or maybe things we haven't addressed. And I'll just open the floor up. So you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
I kind of just wanted to, Professor Irene said that maybe we could add something, and this is more of a comment, just kind of free-flowing thought, going off of bringing every type of species into the dialogue. And I always have this discussion, like with my parents, that borders don't actually exist, like the ones that we create on the map, like the land doesn't recognize that. But yet New Mexicans have such this interesting querencia and tie to place. And I see that within myself. Like I could be driving, I live in the South Valley off of like Bridge in La Vega, and I just feel such a connection to Earth, and it feels like the center of the universe at times. And then like a breeze will come across like the river, and it'll be the middle of summer. And yet at the same time, I feel like my soul is transported to everywhere in the world, yet I'm here. And it's really interesting. So I feel like lately I've been like thinking about like, what is it to own something, to own the land, to own where we live? Like if I feel this connection here and I want to say that I'm part of it, how do I have that discussion without saying that this is mine and this is only mine? And I don't know if that's because I'm definitely like Chicana, but I'm also American. So maybe it's like this capitalistic system that we're now living in, to where we have to own everything. We have to like take something and make it ours instead of just living more naturally with it. So I was really inspired by how you started the dialogue off, Kevin, with just talking about spaces and how we relate to them and how to live with them instead of like opposition to them. So, but yeah, thank you to everyone. Oh, and the buzzwords of these monuments and stuff, like totally with you, Tay. Like everyone like is loving to talk about places and monuments right now.
Yeah. Oh God, and you just can like be like, you just learned the buzzwords, you just learned the lingo, but you don't mean it.
Well, thank you for that comment, Katrina. I was thinking also about I mean, it's only very recently that I became a homeowner, and I went through this process of thinking about it, like, you know, what does this mean, you know, now that I also live in the South Valley, and it's a beautiful, beautiful area to live in. And so I appreciate being here. I appreciate living here. I appreciate the people, and understand, of course, that I am, you know, living on land that is indigenous, but how does that connection really come through? How as a person can we, you know, enact that true respect? And so for me, I am really trying to figure out ways to live in better harmony, right? With the land, with elements, with people, with all. Try to eliminate practices, right, that work against life. It's just my own everyday struggle about the choices I'm going to make, and for a few years, my children would sort of, you know, think I was crazy because I try to recapture all the water I use and put it out on the land. And I learned that from one of our adjunct, Joe Garcia, who works at La Placita Institute, and he helps manage the garden in the South Valley. And he's very cognizant wherever he goes. You know, if he sees a bottle of water that's half drunk and just left there, he's like, no, I have to let the water out. You know, and so, you know, I've learned some really beautiful lessons and values living in New Mexico. And I think it is because in a certain way here, more than any other place I've lived, you know, you really see the important influence and beliefs and values and practices that Native people have, you know, that exist, I think, throughout the United States, but in the areas I've been, for some reason, it was more, you know, invisible to me.
Yeah, I mean, just one thing I just want to add to that, and I love that you mentioned how you've grown to be respectful of different, you know, different things that occupy the same space as you. And I guess my comment was more of like the act for me in my Dene heritage is it's a lifelong process of being a good ancestor. So that very act sets up the norms for me to move forward. I'm not claiming that space as mine. I'm just saying I want to have a connect tie to the space. Not this is my territory. I own this now. It's more of like I want to occupy that space in a more synergistic way, and to leave that space as a good ancestor, because what it does is it puts me in an active participant in the interacting with that land, meaning I'm not going to take advantage of the situation where I'm going to be destructive to that land or to other people occupying that land. So it enables a moral footprint for me to be a good person as I move with development, as I move forward. But also it makes me a temporal person too. What I mean by that is that it's an oxymoron to say to be a good ancestor, because obviously I'm not an ancestor yet. But it means I can transfix myself into different places in time to connect to my ancestors, but also to think forward as an ancestor. So it makes me in this kind of this interesting place of transformation, that I can leave a good footprint behind, but also I can learn from people before me, but also can prepare people after me. So.
Other comments? So there's also a larger discussion about land acknowledgement, right? That, you know, that's kind of the becoming the norm and standard among many institutions and organizations, but the real purpose of that is really obviously acknowledgement and recognition of place. But what does that mean when you put that in actions to really reflect who's at the table, inclusivity, and really being that voice for creating spaces. So there's a comment in the chat about UNM being a minority serving institution and creating spaces for Chicanx and Latinx people, and how does UNM reflect this as a minority serving institution? And again, that's a pretty loaded question there too. But you know, obviously, if there is a land acknowledgement from the institution, what does that really mean as far as policies implemented to serve these particular communities, right?
And will they ask the right people to help them do it?
Well, with the question being posed by Ashley, you know, you know, I think UNM is referred to as a minority serving institution and a Hispanic serving institution, right? Does the land acknowledgement itself give UNM, right, or any institution, a kind of status that might be comparable to that? I mean, when we think of HSI, it's a designation that allows universities and colleges to be eligible for certain types of federal funding and grant. But, you know, I mean, if we're going to be critical along the lines that we are, what does that mean? What does that mean to call UNM a Hispanic serving institution if it's not called, right, a Native American serving institution? And all of these can coexist, a minority serving institution as well. And so so, I mean, those titles also in some ways affect resources. Now, whether or not UNM, I'll just speak to the HSI aspect of it, whether or not, you know, the resources that are allocated to UNM for being a Hispanic serving institution are actually making a difference, right, is a great question. And so again, we'd have to look at all aspects, right, in terms of our students of color or minority students receiving adequate support and resources to truly retain them and graduate them. Are faculty truly representative of the student body or the population of the state? Is the curriculum inclusive, right? And so we mentioned this a little bit before in the panel, but I think that this is a topic that continually needs to be dialogued on. And thank you for raising it, Ashley.
So
I have a question.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, go ahead, Kevin.
Well, I was just going to comment on that, is that, so I run a program that's a very specific program to a very specific student population, that's Indigenous students at New Mexico. So the intent is very well taken, but it's the bureaucracy that hampers the work that I do, you know, meaning the built bureaucracy of the university system that enables separation and siloization and creates these divisions among the student population, when in actuality, the student population is more diverse and representative of the state. So the way the structure is developed and maintained usually follows the money, honestly, and how each allocation of funds is spent per department. And I've seen my colleagues in other programs who do not get the same level of funding as other departments do. And it's so unfortunate because and I'm gonna highlight ethnic studies, for instance. Their work is extremely critical right now because of these extreme or the lack of critical race discussions and frameworks that affect all society, especially today, you know, right now, with so many divisions in society right now. Whereas other institutions, and I'm going to pick on engineering because they get a lot of money, they get a lot of funding, and as an anthropology student, they also get more bias towards them too versus other places on campus. And it has to be, the bureaucracy has to be more reflective of, you know, one, the societal needs. I mentioned, like I said, critical race discussions as a truly important model to move forward, but also just to make the funding streams a little bit better. Because as a program administrator, I see some very discrete stipulations on funding that I don't have control over. So yeah.
Can I just say for the engineering department, like I have some PhD friends there, but like, even if you look at the decisions that have been made around that building in and of itself, what type of message does that building as space occupy on the campus? They're not even trying to like follow the style of the types of buildings that UNM has. At least the New Pais building kind of sort of has like a native like kind of Pueblo feel, but the engineering building didn't even try. And I've went in there, I'm a veteran and I work at the Veteran Military Resource Center, but I was interviewing one of the CIA representatives there just for like our newsletter. And just to even get into the building, it's not inclusive to all students at UNM. There's access points at every single door. I couldn't even get in. I had to ask someone to let me in. So like there's just multiple layers upon layers of not being allowed entry into my own university. I was just like, what is the message being sent here?
Hi, everyone. I'm a teaching artist and researcher at the Mexican American Cultural Center in Austin, Texas. And, you know, the MAC has always had an issue of bringing different groups of people in. And a lot of times I think it's based on class as well as race, right? And we have an expansion project going along for $27 million that's gonna add a lot of services, hopefully, and space, but the community engagement process that the city of Austin has been doing, we're a city of Austin facility, has not been inclusive. And there seems to be a big divide between the staff at the MAC who think, you know, we need to make the center more welcoming. Like, how can we make this a space that people want to come and visit? And when I talk to a board member or other kind of kind of upper class visitors, you know, they're like, we want to make it an architectural gem, you know, so that people around the world want to come and like look at our architecture. But my question is to them, you know, if nobody comes, I don't really care what the building looks like, you know. So I guess maybe for Dr. Nunn, I don't know, but you know, addressing those issues of, you know, race and class are so, you know, and intertwined. Like, how do we create up those systems where engagement's more inclusive, and then also just, you know, getting people to museums who may not be used to doing those sorts of activities?
There's a lot of work going on in that right now. And I mean, we suffer the same thing at the National Hispanic Cultural Center, is that we're this, you know, they got an architect and they did this great giant campus that's all very cementy and all very, you know, it reminds me of the church in Cholula, Mexico, where the church was put on top of the pyramid. And, you know, it's very unwelcoming. It's a cement campus. It is not what if we want to serve, if our aim is to serve Latino audiences, if that's our first aim, then we're not doing it right, because we look like a great grand museum. But if it's not something that you can insert yourself into, and you should still try, even if you feel like an imposter or you feel like you shouldn't be doing it, you should still try. or you should write up, you know, some recommendations and get somebody to get them in if you aren't for some reason not at the table, but you should be. What is your role there?
Well, I'm a teaching artist,
Okay.
but I've formerly been a board member, and then I'm actually a student at UNM, and I work for Chicano Studies, but my research is at the MAC. So
Cool. And we can talk about this offline too.
sure.
But, you know, I mean, usually people making those decisions are like the hoity-toity and the funders and the people they've asked because your executive director or somebody knew these people and they can do that. But it doesn't mean that they're representing the community. And unfortunately, you have to fight about it. But you can also do it if you're not, you know, you can also do it subtly by writing up some recommendations and giving some other examples that they can look at is always a really good idea. But I can type in my email and you're welcome. I'm be happy to talk to you more.
Thank you. I very nerdily put together a bibliography for them.
Hey, see, you're on the
Yeah, I mean, it's in the historic Rainy District where Mexicans and Mexican Americans used to live, and nobody lives there anymore because they've all been displaced. And you know, we really think that that's an important issue that needs to be thought about when they're designing these spaces, because the people who it was built for can't come because they live so far away. There's no bus stop.
Right.
But yeah, I could go on, but thank you.
Yeah, but you know what else you should do is you should get some allies at the university.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'll type.
We have a couple good ones. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Anybody else have any other questions?
I think there was a question and a comment from Alice. Thoughts on place as process, Spanish mission churches as a place where the process of conversion took place, courts as a place where the process of injustice takes place, missionary boarding schools for Native kids. So.
Well, I just responded that I thought that's a very good comment with several sub questions to it. Because any place, of course, is shaped by, you know, the past and of course the present. And I really appreciate Linda T. Smith's ideas, you know, about colonialism and how it is that people inhabit spaces that have been colonized. And in fact, you know, her work does in fact sort of shape, you know, my understanding of the university and of education. But we live in spaces that have this incredible layering, right, of dispossession, exploitation, oppression, but also, right, resistance, survivance, resiliency. And so absolutely, I mean, you know, the area, you know, that we inhabit now, of course, indigenous, you know, peoples were forcibly placed in missions, forced to labor, brutally disciplined, forced assimilation, you know, took place. And in many ways, right, the court systems and even the schools, right, and the structures of education are overlays on that, and in many ways support or have benefited from those processes of colonialism. So I thought that was a very good question, Alice.
No other questions, comments?
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone because this has been really fantastic to hear from all of you and to hear from, you know, people who've attended as well. And I mean, it's come up a couple times, you know, from your perspectives as educators or people working in museums, and, you know, the challenge of getting people to see multiple perspectives on the same thing, same place. And I'm wondering if any of you have like a particular story or a time when something worked. When you were able. Kevin is raising his hand. What happened that. How did you get somebody to see these multiple perspectives on something that they on their own probably wouldn't have been able to do?
I kind of raised my hand because of in my current role at INLP, we get visitors everywhere, international visitors and scholars who come in to use our collection. And a lot of them are not familiar with Indigenous people and customs and culture. And we get very, very stereotypical questions, mostly from movies. And also, and the reason why I would raise my hand at you is because anthropologists do this too.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
really? No.
So like in some cases, sometimes they read a seminal paper from an archaeologist, anthropologist, and then that paints the picture for them. Yeah. And the work I do at INLP kind of hits them a lot with collections, and I like to give them books and resources for them to just consume at their own time. Of course, I'm available to take questions, but when you present them something that they're familiar with, like a book, it makes, and I guess that's the authority of knowledge too, is that when it's printed, when it's published, they trust it more than they do, like say, a native person talking to them. and so once they read it, then they come back with more questions. So, but just the ability to just hit them with more books and more information for them to take back with them, it really helps break down those structures. But it's a balancing act, though. Is like, how much do you share and how much do you keep for yourself? Right. So and also too, it's a big humbling experience for me, because I have to check myself too. As a Dene man, I can't speak for Pueblo or Apache relatives. I can't, nor even speak of students who want to reclaim their Indigenous heritage, which I see that a lot too. They know they have ancestry, but they can't connect with it, or they don't know how. So I can assist them in how I can. But so I usually go back with their comfortability of their knowledge systems that they're aware of, such as books, and it helps win them over in that way. So
thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I thought the example I might share is as a graduate student, I was doing work on looking at African peoples in Mexico specifically. And I remember being in a graduate seminar. One of my peers was a student from Mexico. He was an older student. He had been a sort of a bureaucrat in the government and had actually worked in the census office. And I gave a presentation once in the grad seminar, and some of the work I was doing on communities in Afro-Mexicano communities in Oaxaca. And his name was Juan. After class, we walked to the elevator and he said, there aren't very many there weren't very many Africans in Mexico. And then I asked him, really? Well, I've seen, the census records, in the late 1600s and 1700s, and even early, 1800s. I saw him a couple of years later, and it was interesting. We ran into each other again in the same elevator, and he said, you know what? I went back, and that he looked through, because he worked at the census office. And he said, he himself, an educated Mexican man, who actually, in some ways had some records available to him, but had never asked the question. In fact, I would say probably had been discouraged from asking the question. So I think that the basic idea of raising questions is important in any of our spaces.
Thank you.
Good deal. That's a nice note to kind of wrap things up here. So a plug for the book. If you have not received your copy, there's going to be one lucky winner that's going to get a donated copy. So Vanessa was on earlier, and so I think Barlene said that she would draw somebody from the participant list. Is that how that's going to work?
Yep. Yeah, I'll draw.
Okay.
So it was a nice, pleasant surprise. So I'm excited about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and so you're in for a real treat. You'll learn about obviously a lot of the themes that we talked about relating to homeland and place and the love of that. In addition to a chapter on La Llorona, and one of my favorite quotes here was by Dr. Patricia Trujillo, and I'll end with this because it's kind of a fun note talking about Sonic. So she says, and I cannot imitate her voice, but not even joking. One of my grandma's signature meals when I was growing up was the brown bag special. This place, as much as any around here, is part of the culture. Espanol and Sonic, that's Querencia. I love the concept of Querencia. It really resonates with me. I also love to think of it as a neologism that connects the two Spanish words, querer, to love, to want, and herencia, heritage. And so I think that's a good summation of how we think about place, and that food and culture really embody all of that. And that Sonic too can also become that place of belonging, right? And so it's a really fun chapter. You're in for a real treat once you start thumbing through the sections there.